There is a sentence that I fear the most. The phrase is, "What do you want?" Now I'm going to tell you why I'm afraid of these words. 3 years ago, I met this man, Steve, by chance. I met him through a friend. As soon as he saw me, he said he had found his dream girl and that he would do anything I wanted. When I asked him to prove it, he ran into the kitchen, grabbed the knife, and said he would show me his heart. I was surprised and held his hand, and from then on, our romance began. Then, one day, during a date, Steve asked,
"Is there anything you want to do these days?"
I said jokingly, "I want to kick my boss's ass."
"That's a good idea,"
he said with a smile, and I just smiled. But the next day, he messaged me saying he broke my boss's hip bone. I thought he was joking, but the next day, my boss called me and said he was in the hospital. He said he got his ass beaten by some crazy guy. I was shocked and called Steve, and he told me,
"Your boss can't even walk. How are you feeling? Refreshed now? I had to pay a lot of money for the settlement, but that's okay."
I was shocked and angry at him. I yelled at him and asked him why he did that. He said, as if he was embarrassed,
Wasn't that what you wanted?"
From then on, I thought I shouldn't even joke with him. Then, sometime later, while shopping with him, I looked at a luxury bag and blurted out something without realizing it. "Wow, if I had that bag, I would be happy even if I ate poop." But after saying that, I felt a strange gaze on me, so I looked to the side. Steve was looking at me with big eyes. With a trembling voice, I asked why. Then he looked at the bag and said,
"I'll be right back."
And then he quickly ran outside. I called him, but he didn't stop, and I didn't know where he was going. A day or two passed, and no news was heard from him. I was overwhelmed with anxiety. A few more days passed, and Steve came to see me. He smiled brightly and walked toward me like a fashion show, holding the bag.
"Now who's the happiest in the world?"
"How did you buy it? It's hard to buy that even if you save up your salary for like 3 months," I asked in surprise.
My fists were having a hard time. I think I robbed like 12 people. Now, is there anything else you want?
I was shocked and speechless.
Oh, is it that touching?
He was still grinning, unable to understand the situation. I felt like he wasn't normal and I couldn't handle him anymore, so I told him I was breaking up with him. Then his expression changed as if he had been hit in the back of his head, and he asked,
"That was a joke, right?"
I said with a serious expression that it wasn't a joke, but he smiled and said,
"That's funny."
I said firmly that I wanted to end the relationship. Then, with his eyes twitching, he said,
"If that's what you want, we should break up. But we can still be friends even after we break up, right?"
"No, let's never see each other again."
"That's impossible for me."
"If it's too hard, just think that I don't exist in this world anymore. Close your eyes and imagine that I have left this world." He sobbed and ran out, so I thought I was done with him. But after some time, someone knocked on my house during the night. When I looked out the window, it was Steve, and I screamed in anger, "I definitely told you to forget about me."
No matter how hard I try to erase you from my mind, I can't. So I guess I'll just have to get rid of you.
He had a big pit bull with him, and I was shocked and called the police. He was arrested by the police, who soon arrived. I told the police that he planned to make my face unrecognizable by having the pit bull bite my face. The idea was that if he did that, he would be able to forget my face. He ended up going to jail, and I moved out. However, sometime later, after he was released from prison, he sent me a text message, and the contents of the text message were as follows.
"I haven't forgotten you yet. Soon, I'll destroy you completely."
I'm Maya, and this story takes place when me and my family went on a cruise ship for our holidays. I can say confidently that this event is one that I will never, ever forget. Just for context, my family consists plainly of just me, my mom, and my dad. I was around 10 years old, and being such a young girl, I got bored easily. My parents wanted to check out the bar. Obviously, they couldn't bring me, so they left me in the kids' area. It was a place where parents could leave their kids under the supervision of the cruise staff. I met many other kids there, and soon I became friends with two girls. Let's call them Emily and Rosa, who were both roughly the same age as me. As we were all chatting, Rosa suggested that we play hide and seek. She told Emily to count and then grabbed me, saying she knew a perfect place to hide where Emily would definitely not find us. So as Emily started counting, Rosa took my arm and showed me the hiding place. Opening a door, Rosa pointed down a flight of stairs. "We go down there," Rosa said. At first, I was a little reluctant as the cruise staff had told everyone before boarding that only staff were allowed to enter this area. But Rosa kept on begging and begging, so finally I agreed. As we made our way down the stairs, we started looking for rooms to hide in, and that's when I saw it. It was at the end of the corridor, a large wooden door. As Rosa and I got closer, we could see the dust that covered the door. We could smell something rotten coming from the wisps of aged wood. Looking back at it now, these were obvious red flags, but Rosa and I were young and naive, so we entered anyway. It didn't take much strength to open the door, as it already looked fragile enough that a strong gust could break it down instantly. We entered, and it was pitch black. Rosa had a mini flashlight in her pocket, and that's what we used to illuminate the room. We could hear the faint sound of Emily's voice searching for us, and we couldn't help but giggle. We knew it would be ages till Emily found us, and that was somehow hilarious to us. But that's when things started going south. Rosa had gotten up and decided to explore this old room. She took the flashlight with her, so I was left in the dark. She told me to stay next to the door to see if Emily was coming. Rosa went off wandering into the pitch black silence, and that's how it was for a few seconds. Just pitch black silence. Until Rosa's screams and rapid footsteps filled up the room. I remember her running to me, grabbing my hand, and us bolting through the door and up the stairs back to the kids' area. Rosa's face was white. All the color drained, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. I asked her what happened, and that's when she told me. The real reason Rosa wanted to hide in this area was not because she actually wanted to play hide and seek, but because during the night in her bed, she would hear these awful clicking noises that kept her awake for most of the night. Seeing as her room was directly above this one, she suspected that the noise was coming from this room. While she was exploring the dark room, Rosa heard the clicking noise she had heard every single night and went towards it. That's when she saw the source of the noise. It was a woman, thin, with black hair tied in a disheveled bun. She had massive eyes and an awful, awful smile, which showed her mouth with no teeth. Wearing ripped clothes, and the areas that weren't ripped were covered in what looked like blood. The woman had seen Rosa and began chasing Rosa, but on her hands and knees like a dog. And that's when Rosa grabbed me and we escaped. From then on, the cruise for me was ruined. Rosa stopped coming to the kids' area, and I started having nightmares of the woman as I went to sleep. Luckily, the cruise was over soon. I was so glad to be away from that horror boat.
My name is Gus, and this is my story. This took place when I was about 15 years old. It all started during the summer break. Spencer, one of my friends, said he and two others, Jose and Marco, were going up to his beach cottage for 3 days and asked if I wanted to join them. I asked my mother, and she gave me the green light. I packed my bag and said goodbye to my family. Once we arrived, Spencer's mom made us her famous homemade peanut butter cookies. After that, we all went swimming in the lake, played volleyball in the sand, and overall had a blast. Until that night. I got an idea. How about we all go explore the woods? Said Spencer. It's dark out, man. Can't we explore it during the day? Replied Jose. Now, where's the fun in that? I said. I'm down if you're all down, Marco said. We all nodded our heads and prepared to head out. Spencer got a lantern. Marco and I got flashlights, and Jose got a fire extinguisher and a lighter. Okay, I somewhat understand the lighter, but why the fire extinguisher? Marco said. You don't know what could be out there, man. Take it from me, Jose replied. With that, we walked out the back door and into the woods, following the train. We began to hear a strange noise coming from our left, toward the beach. About 5 minutes in, our suspicion grew as we heard it get closer. We all formed a circle in an instant to see what was going on in all directions. That's when we heard a man yelling at the top of his lungs, and he was getting closer by the second. I pointed my flashlight in the direction I heard the noise, and what I saw terrified me. An old man, possibly in his mid-70s, was staring at the moon with something in his hand. I pointed it out to my boys, and they had the same reactions. But then Marco stepped on something, loud, drawing the man's attention. The man then looked at all of us, revealing what he was holding, and what I saw got my attention. The man was holding an axe. He then charged at us at full speed, and we were all terrified until Jose stepped in front of us and sprayed him in the face with the fire extinguisher, temporarily blinding him. We took this opportunity to run back to the cottage. We were all exhausted and terrified, afraid that the man would find us again. As a result, we decided not to call the cops. My friends and I begged Spencer's mom to take us home the next day, and she agreed. I never told my parents that this ever happened, knowing they wouldn't believe me. Sometimes I think back and remember this story, and ask myself, what would have happened if Jose never brought the fire extinguisher? Or worse, what if I never pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sound?
3 years ago, my friend John asked me to go with him to an abandoned house. It was an abandoned house that was famous in our neighborhood. Famous because it was haunted. Everyone who went into it came out injured or crazy. I told John I would never go there, let alone inside, but he demanded for me to go, saying he would introduce me to a nice pretty girl I'd been wanting to get to know. Knowing that, I couldn't refuse. We went to the abandoned house, and as soon as we stepped inside, we saw a large portrait of a family. The people in the portrait were all baring their teeth like animals, and there was blood around their mouths. The painting gave me goosebumps. We kept walking around shining the flashlight here and there. Then suddenly I heard the sound of dishes clattering from the kitchen. I was startled and pointed the flashlight in that direction, but there was no one. Plates, forks, and knives were neatly arranged on the main table. As I approached, I had noticed that there were bones on the plates. It looked as if a human skull was split into several pieces. I screamed and ran to John and told him, "Let's get out of here." But John said, "I came all this way. Allow me to give a high five to the ghost, and then we can leave. Now, let's go to the second floor." No matter how much I begged him to leave, he wouldn't listen. We went up to the second floor, and there too were many paintings hanging on the walls. They seemed to be old paintings of the family's ancestors, and their faces were distorted and creepy. They had red skin with pimply dots all over, and long fingernails. I entered the first room. As soon as I opened the door, a dark figure shouted from inside the room, "Looks delicious!" And then a skeleton figure of a woman crawled towards me. I was startled, and I took a step back. Cold air hit my face, and then the woman disappeared. I thought I was hallucinating due to my extreme fear, and my body started to shake. It was then that it happened. I heard John screaming from the other room, so I ran to see what was happening. However, when I tried to open the door, it was locked. "John, open the door!" I twisted the doorknob and yelled for him to open the door, but all I could hear from behind the door was John groaning and the sound of dishes clinking and some people laughing. I slammed into the door with my whole body, but it wouldn't budge. I tried to look around for the key, but I couldn't find it. Then I heard John say something. I put my ear to the door and listened closely. "I'm ecstatic," he said. I kicked the door for a while, but no chance, so I called the police. Even if I had to face punishment, I thought I had to save John. After a while, the police arrived. They were angry at me, saying that in this house, dozens of people had died. They broke the doorknob and went inside. When the door finally opened, we were shocked by the sight of John. He was lying on a large table wearing nothing but his underwear, and there were several forks stuck into his stomach. There were plates surrounding him filled with black liquid. And John, he was muttering the same thing over and over again. "Enjoy your meal! Enjoy your meal!" We screamed, but John just continued to mutter to himself, "Please, eat this as well." He grabbed the knife and tried to stab himself in the stomach. As the officers approached and tried to rescue him, he swung at them with the knife. "I won't give you my flesh," he screamed. The police barely managed to gain control of him. He left the house on a stretcher, screaming, in tremendous pain, and then fainted. He was then taken away in an ambulance. He underwent surgery at the hospital. When I visited him a few days later, he didn't even look at me, but just looked at the ceiling and smiled. Oh, that night was the best night of my life. When I entered the room, the family was skinny from prolonged hunger, but they were so beautiful that I decided to satisfy their hunger. I lay down on the table and they started eating my flesh. Seeing them happy made me so happy that I couldn't stop laughing from joy. I couldn't believe I could provide meals to such noble people. It was only then that I realized the reason I went into the house was for them. Bloody tears started to flow from his eyes, and suddenly he glared at me and shouted, "But why did you come in during mealtime? If you hadn't disturbed me, they would have eaten all of me. Take me back there. They are waiting for me." He grabbed me by the collar and demanded. The nurses and doctors came running and held him back. I was so shocked that I had no choice but to leave the hospital room. He was no longer the John I knew. I couldn't say anything. I just cried. I just kept hoping it was all just a bad dream. A few days passed after that, and I didn't have the courage to contact John again. After some time, I learned he had tried to rip out his stomach with his hands, saying he had to give the food to the family in the abandoned house. He was eventually admitted to a mental hospital. While he was in the mental hospital, he drew the faces of the family of the abandoned house. They were thin, with long teeth and fingernails. They looked more like monsters than people. Today, I often think about what it might have been that John saw. I can't even imagine it. I just hope that John gets back to his old self.
This is a story from my foolish early 20s. At that time, I was really into ghost hunting. I had a best friend named Joshua, and we always went to supposedly haunted places. Then one day, we decided to visit a hotel that was famous for being haunted. There was nothing special about the hotel, other than the fact that it was a slightly old-looking building that had eerie music playing in the lobby. We entered the haunted room while singing a song that was supposed to summon ghosts. I was reading an article about the place on my cell phone, posted on a ghost hunting community.
They say there are 3 rules that must be followed in room 704. First, never allow food smells to be present in the room. Second, always wear clothes in the room. Third, never leave the closet in the living room open for more than 1 minute.
Then Joshua asked,
"What happens if you don't follow those rules?"
I answered,
"It says your intestines will be pulled out." By who? Is there a horrible monster hiding in here?
Then he swung open the closet door in the living room. It was empty but had a foul smell. Plugging his nose, he said,
"Someone must have pooped here before."
Then as he closed the closet door, he continued,
"Oh, I'm hungry. Let's have some food and start hunting ghosts."
He called room service on the phone. However, the staff said that room service was not available for this room. He got angry and complained to the staff, who eventually offered to bring him food. but the staff told him that he had to finish eating within 10 minutes and put the dishes out in the hallway. Soon, our steaks and hamburgers arrived, and we started to chow down while looking for traces of the ghost. While we were using the electromagnetic wave meter, the closet door suddenly burst open. We looked at the closet in shock, and at that moment we saw something that would haunt us forever. It was a strange creature that looked like the heads and arms of about 7 people stuck together. It had no legs, and the many heads and arms all moved separately in a grotesque manner. The forearms and head were extremely large, and the faces were as pale and expressionless as corpses. It crawled to our food and started eating the leftover steak. I tried to film it with my camera, but the camera couldn't capture it. The being ate in an instant and went back into the closet and closed the door. When I saw it, I was filled with fear, and I said to Joshua,
I have to get home before that monster gets hungry again.
Then he said,
What are you talking about? You can't just leave after seeing something sexy like that.
Then he ran and pounded on the closet, shouting,
Hey, monster, try this too.
He threw off his t-shirt and patted his bulging stomach.
Do you want to try human meat too? Look at this plump skin.
He opened the closet door, but it was empty. I chuckled at him, but the flame of fear was still burning in his chest. We watched TV, hunted around a bit, and soon fell asleep. But after a while, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a scream. And when I looked in the direction of the sound, I saw the huge being I had seen earlier, sitting on top of Joshua, pinning his arms and legs down while sniffing his stomach. Then his numerous hands began tearing at Joshua's stomach. I wondered if I was dreaming, but Joshua's loud screams pierced my ears.
Ah! I'll give you something else. Please stop!
It wasn't a dream. I screamed,
Joshua!
I kicked at that huge thing as hard as I could, but it didn't budge and pulled on my leg. Then it squirmed its heads around in an attempt to bite my stomach. I barely escaped by kicking at the heads like crazy. My legs were shaking so hard that I fell to the floor. The being looked at me and started eating Joshua's intestines. Joshua mumbled breathlessly,
Louis, I should have just gone home.
I called the hotel lobby and, out of breath, spoke to the staff.
Now, in the room, my friend is being eaten.
The employee asked me what I was talking about. I shouted,
Quickly, grab a knife, a gun, or anything and get up here!
I hung up and ran back to Joshua. The giant being laughed gleefully as it chewed his intestines. I took out the Bible from the drawer and recited some verses out loud, but the being did not respond and continued eating. There was nothing I could do. I cried out in despair and fear. Right then, a hotel employee knocked, and as soon as he came inside and saw the gruesome scene, he vomited. The gigantic being had already disappeared. Blood stains stretched from the bed to the closet. The employee immediately reported it to the police. When the police arrived, they were distressed to find Joshua's intestines missing without a trace. The police officers just stood there dumbfounded and kept repeating that this couldn't be happening. A few days later, I went back to the hotel room to see the manager, who yelled at me.
Your friend called it. It doesn't eat human meat.
I shouted at him.
You already knew what could happen?
Then he sighed and said,
As long as we fed them animal intestines once a day, there were no problems. That room is the most expensive room, so it would be a waste to leave it empty. But you provoked them.
I told him.
Okay, it must be hard for you to keep feeding that bastard, but I'll take this opportunity to get rid of it for you. So just wait a minute.
I went back angry, and for the next 6 months I trained, learning deadly martial arts. Then I went back to the hotel room to avenge Joshua, to tear that monster apart. I packed up a bunch of sharp weapons and went. I set out a bunch of pig intestines in front of the closet and shouted, holding a dagger in each hand.
The highest quality pork has arrived.
After a while, I heard the closet door open and saw it. That gigantic being. It began to eagerly tear into the pig intestines in front of it. But among the many faces that writhed around its body, I saw one familiar face. That was Joshua.
My name is Vasundhara, and I'm from India. I have been following your YouTube channel for quite some time now and thought of sharing a story with you. In 2009, my father, who's now retired, was in the Air Force. The cantonment was an old palace donated to the state by the royal family of Baroda. It had a violent past, especially during the British Raj, involving murders of both Indian and British soldiers. The house that we were staying in was not in good shape, but we had to take it because there was no other ones available at the time, and staying outside the cantonment was not an option. My mother and I always had a feeling that something was off about the house, but my father never believed us. He was a stereotypical non-believer and always had an answer ready whenever something weird happened in the house. As time passed, we all began to believe that it was just our minds playing tricks on us, but everything changed one evening. My parents had a habit of going for walks before dinner, and on one of these occasions, they left me at home alone. I had been playing video games and watching TV before falling asleep. I had woken up drenched in sweat and with a feeling of dread, and then I saw it. An ugly man with a horizontal slash across his face stood in my room. The lights were on and I could clearly see his features, or lack of them. He had dirty blonde hair and completely whitened eyes. His jaw seemed to be broken and hung. He wore an old blue military uniform and there was a broken rifle under his arm. He didn't seem happy about me being there, which was understandable since those old British soldiers were known to be terribly racist and would murder Indian men. I stared at the man, terrified, but he turned around and walked out of my room. I jumped out of my bedroom window and ran to my neighbor's house, since I didn't have a mobile and the landline was in the drawing room where the man had gone. I made a choice. My neighbors didn't believe me and thought it might have been an intruder and tried to enter the house, but I stopped them by begging them not to do so. Once my parents came to know about it, we left the house and made arrangements elsewhere. We found accommodation in another house just outside of the cantonment. The worst part was no one believed me except my mother. My father thought I had some kind of breakdown and made me see a therapist. After a while, almost 3 years later, I started to doubt my own story and thought it was just a thing I did to gain attention. But I was never wrong, as one night there was a massive commotion in the cantonment. The next day, my father asked in the office about it, and what he was told is still burned in his brain to this day. A family that stayed just 2 houses away from us was watching television when an ugly blonde man with a nash across his face entered and pointed his broken rifle at them. The woman had screamed and picked up her newborn and 3-year-old and ran out onto the streets while the husband had frozen. Nothing had happened, but the man had collapsed onto the ground and had severe issues afterward trying to deal with what he saw. My father couldn't believe what he was hearing. He still wonders what would have happened if I hadn't woken up or had the foresight to run to my neighbors. I visit the cantonment from time to see my friends, and I've heard that the man has become a common occurrence. They're planning to break down the houses there, but recently he was seen at the gates of the cantonment by the guards. I think he haunts the entire Air Force cantonment.
When I was in high school, there was a girl named Natalie that I had a crush on. In fact, almost all the boys at school were fascinated by her beauty. But I couldn't speak a word to her throughout my high school years. Then, when I became an adult, I started working at a restaurant. One day, she came there to have her meal. To my surprise, she pretended to know me first, and I had a conversation with her for the first time. The moment she called my name, I felt like I was in heaven. But she was with another man. He was my high school classmate, Marcus. He seemed very close to Natalie, and I was so jealous of him. I had a short chat with her, and because of her beauty, I stuttered like an idiot. When I got home from work, I screamed at myself in the mirror because I was so disappointed that I couldn't have her. However, she came to the restaurant frequently after that, and we gradually became close. Then, one day, she came to the restaurant by herself. So I asked her where Marcus was, and she flatly said that he had left. Then she said something unexpected to me.
Do you want to come over to my house?
When I heard her say that, I was so shocked that I almost spilled my food on her. But I couldn't hesitate, made an appointment with her right away. Then I came home, buried my face in my pillow, and rejoiced. A few days later, I went to her house. I knocked, and when she opened the door, I was a little surprised to see that the floor of the house was covered in plastic, and when I went inside, there was a painting hanging on the wall. I remember that she was good at drawing when she was in high school. She said her dream was to open an exhibition. However, when I looked closer, I noticed something strange about the painting. It was a painting of Marcus rolling around on the floor in pain. It was so real that you could hear Marcus's moans in the painting, so it felt like watching a real scene. I got goosebumps all over my body.
I drew it really well, right? Can you vividly feel Marcus's pain? This painting will surpass the Mona Lisa.
Her voice got very loud and her eyes sparkled. It was a sight I'd never seen before. I followed her to the living room, where several paintings were hanging on the wall. They were paintings of men I didn't know, and what all the paintings had in common was that the men were in extreme pain. A man was crying and crawling with an axe stuck in his back. A man had bandages all over his bloody body. One man had his limbs tied and spiders crawling all over his body.
Humans are most beautiful when they are in pain. So I always think about how I can make people suffer the most. Which of these men looks the most in pain?
She said with a smile. For a moment, I started to think she was a psychopath. I felt cold sweat running down my spine. Marcus appears to be in a lot of pain in that painting. How did you draw it so realistically? I asked her.
I hit Marcus with a hammer. After about 3 hits, that beautiful expression came out. He lived a really successful life because he left such a masterpiece.
You hit him with a hammer! I was startled and shouted in a shaky voice. And when I looked closely, Marcus looked as if he was crying out for help in the painting. I felt cold sweat soaking my entire body.
Have you ever heard this? Art is pain,
she said with a smile, and then walked into the kitchen and pulled something out of her freezer. It was a frozen mace. She ran at me with it and swung it at me. I instinctively avoided it and ran like crazy to the front door. And she followed and shouted,
"Now it's time to paint!"
I barely managed to open the front door and run out, and the mace she swung hit her door and I heard a loud bang.
"Come on, I'll draw you really well,"
she screamed, and I ran away and called the police. Police soon began investigating her, and the results confirmed that she had killed 4 men, including Marcus, before dumping them in a river dozens of miles away. And the corpses all matched the men in the paintings. She was sentenced to life in prison. I couldn't get out of bed for several days because of the shock of that day. What would have happened if I had been a little late when running away, lost my footing, or failed to open the front door? There'd probably be a painting of me crying on the wall of her house. This is a story that happened to my dad back when he lived in India and was around 14 years old. My dad lived in a relatively rural area that wasn't far from patches of vegetation or forests. He and his neighbors' houses were roughly connected through a small walkway and a back door as if you were entering through someone's backyard. He and his neighbors had several servants in the houses who did chores and other work in the house. And there was one girl in particular who was typically cheerful and would come to his house to fetch the fresh milk from his cow. One day, she walked into the house in a very strange manner, as if she was completely tired, dragging herself through the door with a blank expression on her face, practically limp as she walked around. My grandmother asked her, "What are you doing? Stop behaving so strangely and grab the milk." After that, she walked back into his neighbor's house in the same manner, and my dad didn't give another thought about it. Then, a few moments later, my dad heard a scream and people yelling, "Come quick!" My dad and his parents rushed into the neighbor's house, and they saw the girl on the floor being restrained by 3 grown men who were also servants of the house. Her arms and legs were thrashing and flailing about, and she was shaking violently. Despite the men being really strong and holding her down, she was still flinging her arms and legs effortlessly as if she wasn't being restrained at all. My grandmother yelled to get a witch doctor, and at this point my dad started to look pissed off. He yelled at them to get a real doctor to help her out, since it looked like she was suffering from a heart attack and needed real medical attention instead of spiritual help. Nobody listened to him, and after 15 minutes, the witch doctor arrived. Meanwhile, the girl was still being restrained and shaking violently. The witch doctor, assessing the situation, took off his slipper, grabbed the girl's hair, and smacked her on both sides of the cheek. My dad was almost about to restrain the witch doctor, getting even more enraged, thinking they were making the situation worse for the girl who's already suffering. But then, she stopped shaking. Still on the ground, her eyes wide open, she lied there, and the witch doctor, still gripping her hair, said, "Which tree did you come from?" The girl remained silent, and the witch doctor asked again, "Which tree did you come from? If you don't tell me, I will trap you in this bottle." My dad was slightly perplexed at that statement, but went along with it, and by now there was a crowd of 30 people all around the neighborhood gathered around the girl, checking out the commotion. The girl then released herself from the grip of the witch doctor and got up, and began walking towards a forest separating the neighborhood. When she stopped in front of one of the trees, she collapsed and woke up confused, seemingly back to her normal self, now asking what happened and why everyone was surrounding her. The witch doctor explained what had happened, and the girl stated that her mother had visited her the night before. Her mother had died a long time ago, shortly after she was born, because of a train accident. It is said in those parts of India that spirits inhabit banyan trees, and not all of them are friendly. My dad still says that if those guys were somehow acting in an elaborate prank, that they did a really damn good job at fooling some 30 people in the village. If not, however, then I don't think it was her mother that visited her that night.
I'm a man in my mid-20s. Something unbelievable happened to me a while ago, and it hasn't stopped. 3 months ago, I posted something very angry in this community. At that time, I was failing at everything I did. I was running out of money, and my girlfriend had just dumped me. So, I became angry at the world and cursed the sky itself. But why? Someone read my post and sent me a message. He said he would help me out and give me some money. At first, I thought he was a scammer, so I told him my bank account number and said I would kill him if he didn't pay me. But he actually deposited $1,800 into my account. I was so surprised that I eventually agreed to meet him. But I didn't realize at the time that it was a temptation from Satan. I showed up at the address he gave me. It was a building in the middle of a city, and I went into room 632 where I was supposed to meet him. There was a large open space inside, and in the center was an artificial fountain with some sort of red liquid flowing through it. I couldn't see clearly, but it felt as if it was filled with red smoke. After a while, a man walked into the room wearing an angry expression. It wasn't until I heard him laughing that I realized he was actually smiling. It seemed as if he was forcing the smile. He said his name was Malozul and offered his hand. His hand was reddish-brown and looked like leather, not human skin. I was surprised when I saw his face up close. His eyes looked like red jewels, but they were so cracked that they looked like they might break at any moment. His nose was long and harpoon-like, and his Filterman jaw had teeth sticking out like horns.
You asked why life is so painful, and I called you here to give you the answer. It's because demons like me are manipulating your life behind the scenes to make you miserable. We get tremendous pleasure from tormenting people, so we work like hell to hear the screams of one more individual.
Okay, Did you really think wearing a mask with such an ugly nose and talking like that would fool me?
I pulled his nose, which immediately cut my hand.
Ah! What is this? Is this a real nose?
He was holding a cup in one hand that looked like it was made of human skin, and he scooped up some red liquid from the fountain and handed it to me.
I've seen the evil talent within you. You hated the world. You hated God. That's the spirit we need. Satan wants to use people like you as a part of his army. If you become Satan's servant, you will realize how truly boring human life has been so far.
The liquid in the cup he handed me gave off an astoundingly sweet scent. I took a sip, and it was as sweet as 1,000 cans of cola coursing through my entire body. I was so dazed by the overwhelming ecstasy that I dropped the cup on the floor.
Everyone runs to the fountain and licks it like a dog after just one drink, but you're calm.
He suddenly shouted in an unknown language, and a beautiful woman walked in. Her skin was as moist as water, and her lips were red and shiny like rubies. She was so insanely beautiful that I cursed without even realizing it. She walked over and touched my cheek, and my chin trembled.
If this is part of the bargain, I'll become Satan's servant immediately.
Such a happy slave, aren't you?
I slapped myself to try to come to my senses.
But I'm a free spirit. I don't want to be a slave.
Ha! You have never enjoyed true freedom in your life. Have you ever exploited someone to your heart's content? Or have you ever bullied someone till you've had your fill? I know full well that you've led a boring life your entire existence.
As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly started vomiting. Somehow, wads of cash poured out of his mouth. I was shocked, but the wads of cash kept spewing out and piling up.
Satan said this: "The greatest thing in the world is pleasure." What beautiful words they are!
He wiped his tears with a bill. Then he put the cash in a bag and gave it to me.
Give your soul to Satan, and the world will be yours for the taking.
Without saying a word, I took the money bag and left. The streets were still full of people scurrying around. They didn't know anything. I felt nauseous. I went to the bank to find out if the money was real or fake. I walked up to the counter and handed them a bundle of cash. The banker looked intently at the bills.
This money is from Duke Astaroth. Would you like me to deposit it into your account or exchange it for new money?
I realized that the banknote had a devil's face on it. Is that the face of Astaroth? After leaving the bank, I returned home. There was another message from the strange man. It was about creating a soul contract. After thinking about it for a few days, I couldn't forget that beautiful woman, so I went back to the building from before. He welcomed me with open arms. As he came closer to hug me, I took a step back in shock because his whole body was on fire. He laughed.
Are you ready to set the world on fire?
What happens if I make a contract with Satan?
Then you become a low-level devil. Your first mission will be to make 4 people around you, including your friends and family, suffer. Make them shed tears of blood and gnash their teeth with hatred. Then gradually increase that number. This is how you rise through the ranks. So far, I've driven 137 people into a sea of despair, and 82 people into a whirlpool of anger. That's why I live in a top-class penthouse.
I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in such horrible things. I'm naturally kind.
I turned around and tried to leave. Then he suddenly shouted in that unknown language again in an angry voice. And numerous transparent snakes came out of his mouth and sped toward me. The snakes climbed up my body and started biting me everywhere, and I felt the pain of being bitten by dozens of teeth. Ah! As I felt the blood draining from my body, I saw the transparent snakes' bodies filling with red blood. I ran away, writhing in pain, running out of the building and falling to the ground. People passing by came up to me asking if I was okay, and before I knew it, all the snakes had disappeared. I was taken away in an ambulance, and the doctor asked why I had dozens of bite marks on my body, but I couldn't answer. From that day on, I had heard the voices of countless people shouting in my head.
I will make you experience the greatest pain!
And bizarre things started happening to me every day. I felt tremendous pain, as if hot spears were piercing my body. But all the tests at the hospital showed no abnormalities. A pastor passing by on the street saw me and hit me with a cross as if he was trying to kill me. My friends were distressed, saying they kept hearing the words, "I want to kill you," in their heads every time they met me. It was clear something was going on, but no one believed me. Not the police, not my family, no one. If anyone knows how I can escape, please let me know.
First and foremost, I'd like to state that I am a Romanian, and that the following story is as true as possible. Well, it happened a few years ago when I was at university in a rather small town. I was renting a nice apartment with my cousin, who was 2 years younger than me. We were at the same college. One day, after we finished classes, he and I were walking quietly home, which was half a mile away. We'd had a long day and were exhausted. I'd like to point out that it was around 3 p.m. at the time. Everything was fine until we were about 100 yards away from our apartment. We were talking about tomorrow's tests and other issues when we noticed a guy looking at us suspiciously near the park. I told my cousin to ignore him, move on. I was trying to be calm so as to not show fear or panic. That man approached the street parallel to our apartment and stumbled there, looking at the gate. To be honest, I was a bit reticent about him and his intentions, but I walked up to the gate and gave him a nasty look. The guy didn't move from there and didn't seem bothered by me. The only gesture sketched by the madman was a sadistic smile. I ignored that and went inside with my cousin. On Friday, we didn't have any work, so we relaxed. We ordered some pizza and watched a soccer match. It was 5:30 p.m., and I decided to go out for a run. My cousin stayed in the apartment, talking on the phone with a friend. I stepped out of the yard, and a few steps from the gate, I heard sounds behind me. I thought it was a dog or something, but I decided to turn around and see what it was. Surprise! It was still the same strange man. Furious, I turned to him, asked him why was he following me. He said nothing, turned his back, and walked away. Confused, I continued my run and made up all sorts of theories. What if he was a robber? What if he was a criminal? What if he needed help? I stopped and calmed down a bit, trying to ignore those intrusive thoughts. It was deathly quiet on the street until my phone rang. It was my cousin. I answered it and asked him why he was calling. His voice was shaking. He said he heard someone knocking on the door, and when he looked out the peephole, it was the same crazy guy. I told him that I'd come as soon as I could and that he should hide. 5 minutes later, I got to the gate and saw the man. He had some kind of hammer in his hand. I grabbed a brick in my hand and ran towards him. I yelled at him and threw the brick over his feet. He made a sound of pain and started coming towards me. I was nervous, but I didn't let my emotions show and make me vulnerable. So I charged at him, kicked him hard in the shin. He dropped the hammer and fell to the ground. My cousin came outside and told me to come inside because he had something important to say. The keys to the door were missing. Just before the police came, I checked the stranger's pockets. They were not on him. The police told us that the guy was a burglar who had robbed 4 houses in the neighborhood. We searched with them for the keys, and we couldn't find them. I changed the locks, and frankly, I don't want to go through that again.
This is an incident that happened 5 years ago when I was 9 years old. In my home country, my family used to love snacking on chips all the time. Luckily, we had a small shop in front of our house. It had all the snacks that I loved, and they were cheap, so it was my favorite place. The shop used to be owned by an older lady in her 60s. Let's call her Mrs. Mayer. Mrs. Mayer had one daughter and a very small house. I loved her so much because she gave me a free lollipop after every purchase I made. The last time I saw her was when we visited our home country during our summer vacations before the pandemic hit. For 2 to 3 years, I haven't visited my home country because of the pandemic. But last year, my cousins came to visit us all the way from my home country. I'd asked my cousin multiple times about Mrs. Mayer, but she wouldn't tell me anything. I annoyed her so much that at last she said, "Okay, if you're so curious about her, let me tell you what happened while you were away." My cousin then went on to tell me this story. In the last month that she was normal, Mrs. Mayer was dealing with a brain injury, and as a result, she became paralyzed and had to shut down the business. But after around a year, on a normal day, they heard a knock on the door, so of course my aunt went to open the door. When she opened the door, she was in shock, and her voice stuttered, "Mrs. Mayer?" It was Mrs. Mayer, wearing a traditional Indian dress and holding a very rusty old brown bag. My aunt's voice stuttered again. How can I help you?" My aunt also offered to hold her bag for her multiple times, but she refused every time and got aggressive to the point that my aunt got scared. The last time my aunt offered to hold her bag for her, Mrs. Mayer looked up and stared at my aunt with glowing red eyes and aggressively stomped her foot and said, "No." My aunt got really startled this time. "Tell Mr. Philip I want to take him to the graveyard," said Mrs. Mayer in a husky, low-pitched voice. Now, Mr. Philip was my grandfather, and at the time he was eating his food. "I'm busy right now, Mrs. Mayer," said my grandfather, but she repeatedly said it, sounding more and more frustrated. "Tell Mr. Philip I want to take him to the graveyard. Tell Mr. Philip I want to take him to the graveyard. Tell Mr. Philip I want to take him to the graveyard." My aunt was so frightened that she shut the door hard, but Mrs. Mayer put her hand in the way to stop the door and didn't even get hurt. She slowly pushed the door back open, looked my aunt dead in the eye, and violently screamed, "Tell Mr. Philip I want to take him to the graveyard." My aunt was terrified at this point, but her eyes suddenly looked down at the big, rusty old brown bag. There was blood dripping out of it. Now panicked, my aunt was trembling and rushed to shut the door and managed to lock it. Mrs. Mayer was banging on the window outside for a few minutes, but after she finally stopped, a disturbing wide grin grew across her face. Her eyes still glowing red, she started muttering something and finally left. After that day, Mrs. Mayer was never seen again. Even now, I still wonder what would have happened if my grandfather had gone with her to the graveyard.
This story took place when I was roughly 5 or 6 years old. My baby sister had just been born a year prior to this story, and my parents had also just been divorced, so my mom and stepdad moved me and my sisters into this new house. This house had been built on a hillside in West Virginia in the mid-1800s. It was made out of dark wood that almost gave you an ominous feeling just looking at it. The house had 3 stories. The front door was at the middle story, where our bedrooms and living room were. Upstairs was the attic, but the entrance to it was a pulley door. Downstairs was the kitchen, laundry room, back door, and then a mysterious room. This mysterious room was the only room in the house with a metal door. Cold air would seep from below it, and it had a padlock that only my mom and the landlord had keys for. The landlord referred to it as the boiler room. My bedroom was located directly above the boiler room, and it also had the pulley door for the attic on my ceiling. It didn't take too long before strange things began happening to each member of my family individually, but it began with me. There would be times when I'd leave the room for a minute, and then return minutes later to find things moved out of place. Hordes of wasps and other things would come out of the attic and act in strange ways, always remaining in my room. I wouldn't learn this detail until years later, but my mom and stepdad apparently heard footsteps in the living room, walking in circles almost every night, usually only when one of them was still awake. A skeptic would say that my things being moved was my older sister playing tricks, that the insects were normal, and that the footsteps were creaky wood. However, one night, I woke up and felt like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a little boy standing there, shrouded in darkness. I could only see his silhouette, but he appeared to be the same size as me, so I said, "Hello." The boy answered back and told me that he was from the boiler room and asked if he could play with my toys. I told him no because it was too late and I didn't want to get in trouble. For a brief moment after that, I could make out the boy's expression. My rejection was met with a gaze of pure rage, and then, in an instant, the boy was gone. I told my mom and stepdad about it the next day. They seemed nervous about it, but then they just reassured me that it was a bad dream. Even as a little kid, I was good at reading people. So I could tell that they were holding something back, but I let it be. That night, something else happened. I awoke again to the feeling that I wasn't alone. This time, whenever I turned around, I was met with something sinister. The silhouette of an elderly woman stood hunched over my bed, her face inches away from mine, breathing on me. Where her eyes should have been, there was only darkness. I got up and ran past her, opened my door, and hurried over to my sister's room. My older sister was away at a sleepover, so it was just my baby sister in her crib asleep. When I turned back to the doorway, I saw the woman walking towards me slowly. As she walked past the window, lightning crashed outside. And then, in that instant, the woman was gone. And where she was, it appeared that a wolf was approaching me instead. I looked away for a second, and as I looked back down, the lightning crashed again. And after that flash, I saw spiders on my pillow. I turned to look back to the spirit, and after the next flash, the little boy appeared again. As he got closer and closer to me, I passed out. I woke up in my bed again, drenched in sweat. Many questions raced through my mind at that moment. Soon after telling my mom and stepdad about that experience, we moved out. According to what the landlord told my mom whenever she confronted him about the paranormal experiences, a widowed mother and her 3 children had lived in the house when it was first built. The husband had died during the Civil War. At some point not too long after, the mother snapped and murdered all 3 of her children in the living room of the house, and then stashed their bodies in the boiler room. Those deaths perfectly explained why fast footsteps had been heard in the living room, why my toys and stuff were moving on their own, and why I saw a little boy and an evil woman. It also perfectly explains why we moved out so fast after I told my mom and stepdad about seeing the woman. To this day, I sometimes ask myself, what drove that woman to do it? Grief? Loneliness? Insanity? I'll never know. But another question I have is, if she was willing to do that to her own children, what would she have done to a child that wasn't even hers? What would have happened if my sisters and I had stayed at that house? My name is Adam, and this is a scary story of mine. This incident happened almost a year ago. For personal reasons, I'll change my friend's name to Monica. It all started when my dad bought me a full basketball hoop. I absolutely loved basketball, so this was a dream of mine. I played with it every single day for about 30 minutes or more. And around that time, summer started, and school was ending, so it was even better for me. I should also mention that, as I said, I have a friend named Monica, and we've been friends since I was born, because she lives just a few meters away from my house. Whenever I played basketball, I could see her house's window where her kitchen or living room was. And I, for some reason, sometimes when I shot a shot, I would look over to see if she or her family was watching me play. And I know, it's a bit weird. Now, the day of the incident, I messaged her on Messenger what she was up to, and she said that she was getting ready to go to her grandma's house and stay there for a few days. I was kinda sad because I liked to play with her online or sometimes meet in person, but I couldn't do anything about it, so I just said, all right, have fun. About an hour later, I decided to go into the yard and play some basketball. And then it happened. I got the rebound, and I looked over to her window and froze. There was something that looked like a big, black box in front of the window. And I knew that whatever was there shouldn't be there, because I should be able to see a painting on the wall, and I couldn't. As I was about to start dribbling, I noticed something. The big black box wasn't a box. It was a torso, and the torso started to move down. And then I saw a face, which looked absolutely terrifying. Its grin stretched so wide, and its eyes were the biggest I have ever seen, and they were looking straight at me. Since at that time I was really into ghost stuff, I thought I was seeing the devil. I just dropped the ball and ran back inside. It was me and my 20-year-old sister at home. I tried to tell her what I saw, but she just laughed and told me to stop watching the scary videos on YouTube. And because of that, I was pissed. I grabbed my phone and texted Monica asking if anyone was at her house. And she replied by saying, no. That's where I got super scared. Knowing what I just saw, I told her about it. And she somehow believed me and tried to tell her parents, but she had strict parents, so they didn't believe what she was saying. I was scared, so I just didn't even want to think about it. So I just watched some movies on the TV, which made me a little bit calmer, as my sister also tried to tell me it's all good. A couple months passed, and I started to forget about it. But it wasn't until me and Monica were on Discord talking that I realized she was talking weirdly. I've known her since birth, right? So I know her usual speaking tone, but something was off. So I asked her, "Is everything okay? You sound strange." She said, "No, not really." I said, "Why?" Then she told me what happened last night. She said that she woke up very thirsty around 4 a.m. and decided to go get some water downstairs. As she entered the living room, she looked to her left and saw a big black thing. I don't even know how to explain it. It doesn't look like a human or anything. And it was standing near the window. I saw it. And it was just looking out the window, even though the blinds were closed. As she was about to scream, the thing turned around and smiled so widely, then let out a non-human scream, which let out Monica's scream as she ran to her parents' room, crying and saying that something was downstairs. Her dad grabbed a baseball bat and started going downstairs while her mom calmed her down. After a few minutes, her dad came back saying there's no one in the house, which made Monica even more scared because she thought it was a demon. And of course, since her parents were strict, they didn't believe her, but she slept with them still. After Monica told me this story, I remembered the same thing that I saw. And me and Monica were both scared to sleep that night. But thankfully, nothing happened. It's been almost a year since that incident, and nothing's happened. Me and Monica are still friends, and we still sometimes bring this incident up in a conversation. But we still can't figure out what that thing was that we both saw at that window.
One day, my friend Lucas came running into class and breathlessly said,
Hey, did you hear the news? A few days ago, a man in the neighborhood called the police, but he didn't say anything. So the police went to his house and found him lying in the bathroom with his head cut off and a cell phone in his hand.
Really? If that's true, it's super scary, I said in shock.
What's scarier was that they couldn't find the head. But that night, another person saw someone dressed like a scarecrow running around holding a trident with something round stuck on it. At first, she thought it was a pumpkin or something, but now she thinks it was a human head.
Wow, that's terrifying. It's not even Halloween. Who on earth would do that?
Let's be careful now. If the killer shows up, show your ugly face. Then he'll go find another head.
Dude, how can you make jokes in situations like these?
It's no joke.
As stupid teenagers, we tried to pretend that nothing was wrong, even though we were scared. That night, while I was sleeping, I heard a crow cawing from the window. I mumbled in my sleep, annoyed. Crow, you better shut up before I break your neck. But after a while, I heard someone whispering very softly, maybe you should watch your own neck. I was startled, and I looked out the window to see a man standing there. He was wearing a big hat like a scarecrow, and his face was a bizarre mask made of gunny sacks. He was cawing like a crow. I was so shocked that I screamed until my uvula popped out of my mouth. And at that moment, he opened the window and let himself in. It's so loud, I have to slit your throat to shut you up. I threw the blanket at him, jumped out of bed, and ran out of the room faster than Usain Bolt. He tore at the blanket with his trident and chased after me. I ran and screamed until the house rattled. This quite obviously startled my father, who came running out with his gun, and I started crying and screaming, "Kill the scarecrow, Dad!" My dad went into my room with the gun up and ready, and the man jumped out of the window and ran away. The next day, as soon as I left school, I went to see Lucas, grabbed him by the collar and said, "You were kidding yesterday, right? You owe me a new blanket."
What are you talking about?
His face was a mask of total confusion. However, when I looked at Lucas's scrawny body and thin forearms, he was clearly not the man who had been swinging a huge trident single-handed last night. I was in a huge panic. Then Lucas actually had the stones to make fun of me.
You're such a baby. If a guy like that breaks into your house, you just poke him in the eye with your finger, kick him in the balls, and hit him between the eyes 3 times in a row, and it's over. If I were you, he would be lying in the operating room by now. Pity.
Lucas was punching the air in his imagined fervor, but I couldn't say anything. A few days after that, Lucas didn't show up for school. Then I heard something shocking from my teacher. Lucas had been murdered during the night. He was found with his head cut off, and his fists had holes from spear punctures. But his head was nowhere to be found. The neighborhood was turned upside down, and the entire police force stood guard day and night, maintaining high alert. Then one day, a police officer was found handcuffed in a police car with his head cut off. But this time, there was a video from the car's dash cam. However, the culprit wasn't in the video. At first, all that could be heard was the sound of 2 people struggling. But then the police officer spoke up. "If you're going to cut off my head, do it one go, so it doesn't hurt. You should really let me go. I won't tell anyone I saw you." After that, a dull sound and a scream blasted out, and a moment later, the back of the perpetrator running away giddily, with the police officer's head stuck on his trident. The police did their best to catch the criminal, but to no avail. There were, however, plenty of rumors circulating. Some people said they saw the criminal's face. Some said they knew who the criminal was. And some even said they were the criminal. But it was all lies. After the police officer's death, the killer was never heard from again. But since then, people in the neighborhood still sleep armed. I still have doubts. Who was the culprit? Why did he take those heads? And what did he do with them?
This happened while babysitting. One day, I found a job with a very high hourly wage on a job search site on the internet and decided to work there for a few days. I felt very lucky, but it turned out to be too late when I realized it was bad luck. When I went to the house, I found a 13-year-old boy named Leo alone. He spoke excitedly as soon as he met me. "Hi, Evelyn. There's so much to do with me today." He ran into the living room where there were a lot of tools lying around. I wondered what he was trying to do, but I was worried that something annoying would happen. After a while, I ate with him and sat on the sofa to rest. But he started watching a very dangerous-looking martial arts fight video on his phone next to him. Then he suddenly shouted, "Wow, I want to be like those people, so you can kill people with your bare fists." He clenched his fists, looked at me, and said, "Hold your head down for a moment. I'll hit your chin with my knee." I was shocked and told him not to do it, but at that moment, he tried to knee kick me. I was shocked and ran to another room and locked the door. I was really angry, but I thought it was because he was an immature boy. As I was using my phone alone, I felt relieved. But suddenly, the door opened. He opened it with a key, but he was holding a large monkey wrench. "This looks really cool. I'm going to hit you with this, so tell me how much it hurts." I got angry at him, but he kept running at me, brandishing a monkey wrench. I freaked out and ran out of the house and called his mother, but she said it was just a prank and she told me not to worry. I was distraught, but decided to hold on just a little longer because of the money and moved on. The next day, I went to that house again. Leo was even weirder that day. He was watching a very brutal video on his computer in his room, and it didn't seem like a movie. It seemed like a real video. I told him not to look at that, but he didn't seem to hear me at all. He stuck his head in as if he were going into the monitor and watched the brutal scene over and over again. Meanwhile, he kept muttering things to himself such as, "This is awesome," and "This must be really fun." I got goosebumps and was waiting for time to pass quickly so I could get home from work. After a while, Leo called me, and when I went to him, he was holding a large pair of scissors and shouting, "Evelyn, are these scissors really big? I asked my mom to buy me the biggest one. Don't move because I need to test how lethal this thing is on you." I yelled at him to stop, but then he frowned and started breathing heavily. "If you're going to keep rejecting me like that, why did you come to my house? You don't do anything for me." He was furious and swung the scissors in the air. "Leo, put down those scissors, otherwise I'll call your mom." I picked up the phone and shouted at him, but he burst out laughing. "It's okay, my mom is a nurse, so she can treat you." And then he came running towards me with his scissors wide open. He swung the scissors at me and I barely managed to dodge them, then ran out the front door. Then he opened the window inside the house and shouted at me, "Since you keep running away, I need to get a weapon that can be thrown." I called his mother, explained what had happened, and told her I wanted to quit. But she spoke over the phone as if she was very annoyed. "I'll give you more money, so do whatever he asks." I said I couldn't lose my life for money and hung up, and I never contacted her again. But a few days later, something shocking happened. Leo sent me a photo in which he was making a V with a fork stuck to a woman's neck. Leo said the experiment was finally a success, and he asked me to call him the Fork Killer. I was so shocked. I called his mom, and she said Leo had killed his new babysitter by sticking a fork in her neck. And since Leo was begging her to get a new babysitter, she asked me what she could do. She cried, saying she couldn't believe her son was a psychopath. After some time, Leo ended up in juvenile detention, but I know what he will do when he gets out of prison. Anyone, please never go to his house.
Never show your back to a stranger. This is what my grandmother used to say to me in sign language every day. When my grandmother was 43 years old, an assailant had both of her ears ripped off and eaten. She told me this story every day. Even though I'm now over 20 years old, she still caught up with me every day and talked to me.
That guy chewed off my ear. The bite was so strong that at first I thought I'd been bitten by a dog. I screamed, and he stroked my neck and said, "Be quiet before I eat your vocal cords too." Then he made a clicking sound with his teeth. That sounds so scary. I still shiver when I hear the sound of someone chewing food. And from then on, I started having a speech impediment.
It was 20 years ago, and security in our neighborhood was lax, so not only my grandmother, but many women's ears were eaten by him, but the police were unable to catch the culprit. But I reassured my grandmother, telling her not to worry, as times have improved now. That doesn't happen. But she always told me to cover my ears when I was outside. I told her that one day I'd rip off the criminal's ear and bring it to her. Then, one day, I saw an old, homeless man on the street, and I felt sorry for him, so I gave him money. He thanked me and was eating something strange. I asked him what he was eating, and he answered with a smile.
"This is a pig's ear."
I was surprised and asked him why he ate pig ear, and he smiled and said,
"Actually, I really want to eat human ears, but since I don't have any, I'm just eating these. When I see your ears, my mouth starts watering, and I'm going crazy. I might turn into a dog and eat your ears, so go away."
He ate the pig's ear like a starving man. My heart started racing. I asked him if he'd ever tried a human ear, and he quietly whispered,
"No, I haven't tried it, but someone told me that human ears are really delicious."
Then he suddenly shouted,
"He chewed my ear and said it was really delicious," and he continued to be amazed.
Only then did I discover it. He has no ears. I was shocked. I was horrified and tried to leave quickly, but he kept holding me, wouldn't let me go, and he told me,
"I want to eat your ears too. I don't need any money, so can you just give me a bite?"
He smiled and showed his teeth. His teeth were very sharp. I pushed him away, ran away. I went to my house and asked my grandmother if she remembered the criminal's face, and she nodded her head. I started sketching the criminal's face while talking to her. But as soon as I saw the completed sketch, I was shocked, because the sketch looked very similar to a homeless person I had seen. His half-closed eyes, very wide nose, serrated teeth, and above all, his laughter was very unique. His laugh was very low-pitched, and when I imitated it, my grandmother was surprised, said that she remembered that laughter. So does that mean that the homeless person is the culprit who made my grandmother like this? Although it was late at night, I went back to where that homeless man was. He was lying there. I ran up to him and asked him if he had chewed off my grandmother's ear. Then he said,
"Do you have a picture of your grandmother? I'd know when I see her face."
I grabbed his collar.
"Do you remember the woman you threatened to eat off her vocal cords a long time ago?" "I remember, but the number of women I've threatened like that must be over 10.
I was so angry. I wanted to rip his ears off, but his ears were no longer there. He seemed to understand what I was thinking and laughed wildly.
"I ate my own ear. It was so delicious. I didn't even feel the pain. Why did God only give humans 2 ears? I want more."
Then suddenly he came towards me with his mouth open to bite my ear. I punched him square in the face with all my might. He screamed and fell backwards, but I just kept hitting him. And eventually he passed out. I took a picture of his face and returned home. I showed the picture to my grandmother, and she looked shocked. When I asked her if it was him, she covered her ears and nodded her head. The man hasn't been seen on that street since, and my grandmother never mentioned that man again.
One night, while I was asleep, a sticky liquid suddenly dripped on my face. I woke up, sat up, but to my surprise, there was nothing. Confused, I felt a warm breeze on my face as if someone was breathing on me, right in front of me. There was a tremendous stench, but clearly there was nothing or no one there. Then suddenly, something pounded my chest like a hammer. I fell back with intense pain. I clutched my chest. I couldn't breathe. All I could hear was the strange sound of laughter. I fell out of bed and rolled under the bed in great pain. A loud bang hit the floor next to me. A huge dent was left in the floor. I felt I was going to die if I stayed under there. So I rolled out, stood up, and started swinging my fists at whatever was in front of me. As I punched, my fist was clutched out of nowhere to a stop position, as if I hit an invisible wall. I heard screams, and then the sound of footsteps running out of the room. A loud banging of the front door of the house was happening, with the opening and closing bang of the door. I ran immediately to try to lock it, but the door handle was broken. Slowly, I realized that the foul-smelling liquid was leaking from the walls all over the house. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I took my phone and called the police. The police arrived moments later and began investigating the liquid from the walls, but could not determine what it was. They also examined the dent in the floor of my room. It was strangely shaped like a large hand with 7 fingers. The police left. All sorts of questions unanswered. I was alone again, clearly in agony. This went on all night. The next day, I went to the hospital. The doctor looked me over and asked if I had been in a car accident. He said my body seemed like it had been through some kind of dramatic trauma, that I was recovering from shock. He told me I needed to rest for a while, and I was to stay in the hospital for a day or so. The confusion made me doubt everything, as if I was in delirium. A couple of days later, I was released. When I got home, I was greeted by my next-door neighbor, Jeremy. We spoke, and he started to tell me that he had heard some kind of voice, as if it was a monster or something. He asked me if I also heard such a voice. I replied no. He told me he had an ominous feeling that something unexplainable was going to happen. I thought he would never believe me if I told him what happened just days before, so I just kept my mouth shut. When I returned home, I was more scared than ever before. A few days later, while I was asleep, I once again felt that warm breath on my face. I swung my fist. I heard a strange screaming sound. Blood splattered across the room. I was now clearly seeing blood appear out of thin air like a waterfall cascading to the floor. I quickly ran out of the room and called the police. When the police arrived, there were blood stains all over the room. The color of the blood was orange. There were footprints in the blood stains. Those footprints were odd. Giant feet with 2 long toes. The police were baffled, and although they collected blood from the scene and tested it, they could not determine what the hell this thing was. From that day on, I often heard the turning of doorknobs. I would often grab the kitchen knife in fear. When going to investigate outside, looking through the windows, I could see breathy fog left on the panes of glass. Not to mention the never-ending strange sounds of laughter. I couldn't stand it anymore and moved. After I moved out, Jeremy caught up with me, and he updated me about my old house. A man in his 30s named Petros moved in. He would be seen running around the house at night, swinging a baseball bat at the air. At first, they thought he was crazy. One day, Petros was heard screaming so loud that Jeremy said he would hear the screams, and then in between the screams, loud bangs. One night, it was so bad they called an ambulance in fear. Petros was found clutching his chest. He was rushed to the hospital, where he died, they say, of a heart attack. The doctor said Petros' chest was caved in and the rib cage was smashed full of broken bones. When the police searched, it was the same routine. The front doorknob was broken. Sticky liquid was found all over. In the end, the case was closed, marked as unsolved. Jeremy told me that there was no one living there now, and the house remains empty. I couldn't sleep for days after hearing Jeremy's report. I think I know what happened to Petros. Only those who had experienced it could understand that fear. Scarier is not knowing what that thing in that house was. No one knows what it looks like, and no one could know what it wanted. I myself believe I know nothing. Maybe no one will ever know.
This happened on Christmas Eve of 2016. I was only 12 at the time, and it was me, my mom, and my sister at home. The three of us were getting ready to go to the mall to buy groceries and other things for Christmas. But before leaving, my mom and I had a fight, and she threatened to leave me home alone. Our yaya, Marianne, was on her Christmas break and was in her hometown with her boyfriend. Yaya is usually what Filipino households call their housemaid, and if my mom actually left me, I'd be at home alone by myself because our yaya isn't with us. My mom and I continued to fight. Then she took my iPad away from me. I asked her to give it back, but she refused to do so. I was really angry, so I went to the closest room to cool off. When I came back, I saw my mom and my sister driving away from the house, leaving me behind, alone. I got mad, so I started releasing my anger by yelling across the room and throwing things everywhere, which helped me get my frustration out. A few minutes had passed by, and I heard weird noises outside. I took a peek at the window in the bedroom I was in that had a view of the front yard of the house. I checked to see if my mom and sister had come back. I saw the gate wide open and didn't think much of it. At the time, I was still mad at them, so I locked the door of the bedroom. Later on, I started hearing small, faint noises from the living room. I stayed in the bedroom listening intently, and a few seconds later, I heard someone twisting the doorknob of the room I was in, as if someone was trying to get in. I thought of opening it at first, but then I felt something odd about the situation. I thought to myself, wait, if this is my mom or my sister, then why aren't they knocking? Why do they just keep trying to open the door? I then called my mom on the phone and asked her, "Mom, where are you?" She responded, "At the mall with your sister. Did you forget?" I answered with, "So, you guys didn't come back home?" She said, "No, we're at the mall, and I'm feeling a little dizzy. We're just sitting on a bench for a while." That's when I froze. I realized that someone must have broken in. I mean, none of us were expecting anyone on that day, plus our guests will come on Christmas Day itself, not on Christmas Eve. Then I whispered to my mom on the phone, "Okay," and hung up. The person who broke in was still trying to open the door of the bedroom. I started sobbing quietly as I was scared and was only a child and didn't know what to do. I immediately called our yaya, Marianne, on the phone as the intruder was still trying to get into the room. When Marianne picked up, I said to her, "Yaya, come here. I'm alone at home and no one's here with me." As I was crying, Marianne said, "I can't. I'm all the way back in Samar. That's far away from Manila, and I'm still on my break. Why? What's happening?" As I was crying and watching the door, I hung up. My idiotic 12-year-old self decided to try opening the door. As I went towards the door, I unlocked it, but I immediately grabbed onto the doorknob while putting some force onto it to prevent the intruder from getting in. I looked through the peephole just to make sure if it was someone I knew, like a relative or a neighbor, and what I saw gave me chills. I saw a man who looked really high and had stitches on his face. I immediately tried locking the door again, but it was hard to, since this man had a grip on the doorknob already and was trying to push the door open. I cried even more while trying to twist back the lock on the doorknob. As I was trying to lock the door, I could hear this man breathing really loudly, and he was really strong trying to push the door open. I tried to push the door back and added more force to it, and as a guy with a slim build, this was hard for me. When I finally put enough force to push back the door, I took a risk and let go of the doorknob and quickly twisted back the lock. With luck, I was able to lock the door again, but that didn't stop the man from trying to open the door. After what felt like hours, the man stopped trying to get in the room. I took a peek again from the window, and what I saw from the front lawn view of the window, the gate was closed. But I didn't know if the man just closed the gate and decided to stay in the house guarding me, or if he's really gone for good. A few hours passed by. It was nighttime and really dark. My mom and sister finally returned home, and my mom called me on the phone. My mom said that there's a small problem. It's that she couldn't open the gate. This usually happens if the gate of our house isn't closed properly. This must have been the man from earlier who didn't properly close the gate. And since I was still scared because of what happened earlier, I asked my mom to just keep trying, but she said she couldn't, and the only way for the gate to open was if I opened it from the inside. I got scared even more, because what if the man was still in the house, just hiding and waiting for me to come outside to open the gate, but then capture me as I passed by? My mom and sister were getting annoyed, so I decided to risk it. As I got out of the room, I ran as fast as I could from the living room to the hallway and to the front lawn. I quickly opened the gates while hoping that the man was finally gone completely. It's a good thing my mom wasn't inside the car and was already outside helping me open the gates, since that scared me less. When me, my mom, and my sister finally got back inside, I didn't see the man anywhere, and I checked to make sure. To this day, I haven't told my mom or my sister about what happened with that strange man. And until now, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I opened that door.